Hi everyone, today we're going to be talking about sectionalism. And what we mean by that is there are different sections of the United States. For instance, there's a north section, there's a southern section, western section, eastern, and so on. It's just different sections of the United States. And as we're going today, some of these questions might be difficult, so raise your hand if you're not sure, if you don't understand anything, if you need me to explain something. Some of this stuff we are going to be tested on, and it is important. And the first thing about sectionalism is we're going to talk about economic interest. And the northern and southern states differed economically. And economically is just how they make money. Northern states had a larger population and a big industrial economy based on manufacturing. So lots of people live in the north, and this photo right here is an example of manufacturing. That's just where a lot of people work there. That doesn't have to do with farming. This is where people are making, maybe they're making refrigerators, they're making clothes, they're making stuff. There's no farming going on here. Whereas in the South, the southern states had a smaller population and a big agricultural economy. Agricultural? That just means farming. This photo represents it because that's what the South was. They were very big on farming, in particular with cotton. And as far as economic interest, the industrial North favored high protective tariffs. Okay, and if you remember, tariffs are taxes to protect northern manufactured goods from foreign competition. So if we ever got anything from England or if we bought something from China, they wanted us to put taxes on it so people would buy stuff from the north instead of buying stuff from the south. And the agricultural South was not in favor of this. They did not favor high tariffs that made the price of imports more expensive. And this is how a tariff works, which is a tax. So let's say cloth costs $4 a roll in the United States, and in Britain it costs $4 a roll. So if Britain sells us cloth, the United States government is going to charge a 25% tariff, so $1 is added to the price. So even though it's $4, by the time it gets to the US, it's $5 a roll. And what will happen now, if you live in the United States, are you gonna buy the $4 roll? Or are you going to buy the $5 roll? Most people are going to buy the $4 roll. And this helps American companies because you're buying the American product. Whereas if everybody bought the British product, the American company would go out of business and then there'd be no jobs. And as the United States expands, there begins to be disagreements about whether the new states should have slaves or should not have slaves. And if you remember from our first unit, it was a while ago, but the southern colonies did not have, or the southern colonies had slaves. That's how they made their money. They bought slaves, they traded slaves, so the southern colonies had slaves. Whereas the mid-Atlantic, New England colonies did not have slaves. And northern states opposed slavery and wanted the new states to be free states. So the northern states, as we got all these new places, they wanted them to be free, which means no slaves. Whereas the southern states, they're for slavery, and they wanted the new states to be slave states. So the North and South, not only do they disagree on the economy, but they disagree about slavery. And because they don't agree when these new states come in, they're going to have to try to find an agreement. And usually they don't get what they want, so they have to compromise. The first compromise is called the Missouri Compromise of 1820. And this drew an east to west line through the Louisiana Purchase at the 36 by 30 degree line. And slavery was prohibited above the line and allowed below the line. And except there was one exception to this. Slavery was allowed in Missouri even though it's above the line. And here's an example of it. So these orange states right here are all slave states. The green, these are free states. So slavery is allowed here, not allowed here. But the Missouri Compromise, when we bought the Louisiana Territory, we drew a line right here, and we said if you're below this line, you can be a slave state. If you're above this line, over here, you will be a free state, except we allowed Missouri to be a slave state, even though it's above the line. Next is the Compromise of 1850, and this says California is a free state. And the Southwestern Territories acquired from Mexico would decide the issue of slavery on their own. And when they say on their own, they just mean states would have a vote to decide. And these are the states we acquired when we fought Mexico in the Mexican War and we won. And this is an example of what happened. So California, they say, is a free state. And these territories right here, which at the time was called the Utah Territory and New Mexico Territory, it was up to them if they wanted to become a slave state. Or if they wanted to be a free state, they were going to have an election and they were going to decide. So the government wasn't going to decide that. The states were going to decide that. Next is the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which this is important because the Kansas-Nebraska Act repealed, which means got rid of the Missouri Compromise. Remember, the Missouri Compromise said if you're above that line, you're a free state. If you're below that line, you are not a free state. And what this did is it allowed people in Kansas and Nebraska the choice of slavery. So popular sovereignty, that just means where people vote. That's what popular sovereignty is. The state's going to vote if it's going to become a slave state or if it's going to become a free state. However, this enraged, which means made angry, those opposed to slavery. So people who were against slavery were not happy with this decision. And this led to bloody fighting in Kansas between pro-slavery and anti-slavery forces. So people in Kansas started fighting each other. People who wanted slaves fought people who said there should not be slaves. And what happened is this led to the birth of the Republican Party in 1854. Because when this party was created, Republicans were opposed to the spread of slavery. So Republicans did not want slavery to exist because they thought it was wrong. And this shows the Kansas-Nebraska Act. So if you look back at the Missouri Compromise says these are free states. All right, so no slavery was allowed here. But Kansas-Nebraska Act changes that. It says slavery determined by popular sovereignty. So they were now able to decide. Whereas before, the federal government said, nope, you cannot have slaves. Now they get to decide. They get to vote if they want slaves or not. And there starts to be even more slave issues. Slave revolts in Virginia, led by Nat Turner and Gabriel Prosser, led to harsh laws in the South against fugitive slaves. And what happened is Nat Turner and Gabriel Prosser, they were able to get a bunch of slaves and they started a revolt, which means they started attacking white slave owners. People who owned slaves were attacked by Nat Turner and Gabriel Prosser. Nat Turner and Gabriel Prosser ended up being killed. They were captured, but they did lead a revolt. They started going to war with the people who owned slaves. So after this, white Southerners started fearing slave rebellions. They were afraid the slaves would start fighting them. And Southerners who favored abolition were intimidated into silence. So abolition believes in someone who believes that slavery should be illegal. We're intimidated into silence. So if you lived in the South and you said, I think slavery is bad, they were going to intimidate you. They're going to scare you. They're probably going to beat you up. They'd threaten to kill you. The South believed that there should be slaves. And more issues relating to slavery, and William Lloyd Garrison was the publisher of The Liberator, which is a newspaper, and other Northerners viewed slavery as a violation of Christian principles and argued for abolition, which is to make slavery illegal. So William Lloyd Garrison and people in the North, they thought slavery was bad because they said if you're a Christian, you should not own slaves. That's bad and you shouldn't have slaves. So they wanted to make slavery illegal. And Southerners grew alarmed by the growing force of the Northern response to these abolitionists. So people living in the South start getting concerned because there starts being all these newspapers. Lots of people don't like them. They don't like that they're slaves. So the South starts growing alarmed, which means is they're afraid. There's something called the Underground Railroad. And what this is many enslaved African Americans began escaping the South by using the Underground Railroad. The Underground Railroad was a system that slaves could hide at houses in order to escape to the free North. So remember, the South is where slavery is. So if a slave, an African American slave, is able to escape and go to northern states, they were free, no longer slaves. So they wanted to get to the North. But if you're caught, you can be killed, they can kill your family. It wasn't good. So it was very scary to escape because if you don't make it, it's going to be really bad for you and your family. But what the Underground Railroad is people would help you escape. Maybe they would hide you and your family underneath your house. They had secret rooms. And there was just a lot of stuff that would help people escape. And Southerners were angry that slaves escaped, and they demanded the North return them. However, Northerners would not release the former slaves to the South. So people in the South are starting to get very upset because their slaves are escaping. They're going up north, they're becoming free, and they're trying to say, this is my property. I bought this person, I own them, so if they go, you should be able to give me back. However, the North did not. And something else that's going on during this time is the nullification crisis. And people who supported states' rights had a big meeting in South Carolina named the Carolina Exposition and Protest. And people who supported states' rights felt that individual states should be able to nullify, which means to get rid of tariffs. So remember, the United States had tariffs during this time. Northern states wanted tariffs. But the southern states did not agree. So South Carolina is a southern state. And when they got there, they said, we can get rid of tariffs. And supporters of states' rights also believes that states can nullify, which means get rid of federal law, and leave the union if they choose. And essentially what this means is the southern states now are beginning to believe they can leave the United States and form their own country if they want to. It hasn't happened yet, but that's what they believe. And South Carolina stopped paying taxes, and President Andrew Jackson threatened to send troops to South Carolina to protect federal law. And South Carolina kind of got afraid. They ended up paying the taxes, but they thought that because they were their own state, that they could not pay taxes and that they could leave the union if they want. The women's suffrage movement, which hopefully you remember, suffrage means to vote. Suffrage is vote. Is starting to take place. During this time, women are not allowed to vote. And there's something called the Seneca Falls Declaration. And this was the first conference to address women's rights and issues. And a conference, in case you guys don't know, is simply a meeting to address women's rights. And this movement started before the Civil War and continued afterwards. Some of the important people were Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony, and they felt women should be able to vote, so that's what they argued for. So just as a recap, northern states and southern states have different economies. The North has manufacturing. The South has agriculture. The northern states wanted high tariffs, which is taxes. Southern states did not want high tariffs. Northern states are against slavery. southern states are for slavery, and as the nation expands, northern and southern states cannot agree on whether the new states should be free states or slave states. And what does this lead to? Like, why is this important? Eventually, northern and southern states have too many disagreements. They do not get along, they don't agree on anything. And the southern states decide to leave the United States and start the Confederacy. So they pretty much say, you know what? We don't like the United States, we don't like your laws, so we're going to leave. We're going to start our own country. And the northern states end up going to war with the southern states in the United States Civil War. So they end up fighting each other. They have a war. And this picture kind of shows it. The blue is the northern states. This is the north, and they're going to fight the south. So Texas, Louisiana, Arkansas, Virginia, Florida, all of these red states, they tell themselves, they sign an agreement, and they say, we're not the United States anymore, we are the Confederacy. So they go to war, and it was a very bad war, and the North ends up winning, but it cost a lot of lives, it really damaged the country, and that's because the southern states left. And everything we talked about are some of the reasons why they left. All right, if you have any questions, let me know.